Ahí está. Ándale. Got it. Okay. Oh, te digo, te lenta, lenta, lenta.
Hands are so clean.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. Okay, it's not going to work because of the feedback. Hi, everybody. We're going to get started in 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you for joining us. Super happy to have you on. Appreciative of you taking some time today to kind of be with us. We want to make sure we honor people's time and we stick to the time that we said. So we're actually probably going to get started now and just do some basic introductions. Make sure I'm set.
Should I start introducing myself while you...
Oh, I got it. All right, everybody. So my name is Francisca, Porchas Coronado. Pleasure to be with you all today. I'm both with Mi Gente, which is a national, it's a national political home for Latinx, Latino, Latina, Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, Black and Indigenous people with roots in Latin America. However, it is that our folks sort of have defined themselves or define themselves now. And it is a political home for our folks that are in the progressive movement, that want immigrant rights, that are about queer liberation, women's liberation, that are about workers' rights. And I'm also the founder and director of the Latinx Therapist Action Network. We're going to share the links to the websites in case you're not familiar with either, though some of you probably are, at some point, maybe toward the end or maybe right now. So that's one. The other is I wanted to just kind of name a few things. We are with Griselda Tomaino, who is in Boston. She will introduce herself when she starts her part of the presentation. And we're also with Blanca Valentin, who's also in Boston, both mental health professionals, but also Latinas and part of the network. The last thing I want to say is we want to make this participatory. So we know that with such a large group, it's hard to sort of bring people in to speak. So given we can't do that with the short amount of time that we have, we do encourage people to chime in on the chat. You can ask questions. Obviously, we won't be able to get to all the questions, so we can pull some out, and we will have a record of the questions that were posted, and we'll make sure that we're diligent about answering some of those in the email that we respond if they seem like big questions that we might have not covered in the material. But I do want to encourage you all to participate. And as in all sort of online sessions, you know, I'm home, I have 3 kids, so I can't really control how loud they are. So just, you know, just want to put that out there to give me some grace. So with that being said, I want to go a little bit into framing this conversation, because we can't talk about trauma or intergenerational trauma or any sort of emotionality, I think, of anyone in this country without first framing it with some political understanding, right? And so that being said, I'm going to share my screen. We tried not to make it too presentation heavy, but we also like the idea of you not having to just stare at us as we're talking, but actually have some visuals. I'm a visual person. I don't know about you all, but with that being said, I'm pulling our presentation up. If you do not see it, please let me know, because I'm assuming you are, given I shared my screen. I just want to name this, I just want to name that we do come from a politicized healing lens. I'm not a mental health practitioner, but the network is made up of mental health practitioners that do have a radical lens on mental health. And Prentice Hill is one of my good friends and also an amazing Black healer who has said oppression is how society organizes itself to control and distribute trauma. Again, oppression is how society organizes itself to control and distribute trauma. So we want to make sure that folks understand that oppression isn't something that is void of trauma as a tool that is often wielded at our communities, both communities of color, queer, trans, non-binary, LGBTQIA communities, women, indigenous folks. Like, the list can go on and on of all the folks that have had a conditional relationship to this country and that have been othered in this country. And so wanting to really ensure that the way that society is right now has had a lot to do with the way in which it has organized itself. And with that being said, I do think it's important to emphasize that the conversation we're going to have today about trauma and intergenerational trauma is with the understanding, some basis of understanding for all of us, that this country is a 500-year experiment by Europe, right? By Great Britain, right? This country and the territorial sort of integrity or non-integrity of it is that of genocide of indigenous people, is that of 250 years of slavery and many years of Jim Crow and many years of segregation and many years of the prison industrial complex. And also that, the pillaging and the taking of land, such as the colony of Puerto Rico, or the Commonwealth as we call it, of Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and so it's just important to know that we're sort of swimming in this colonial white settler project, and that we can't disassociate ourselves. We can't disassociate the conversation of intergenerational trauma and trauma from it. So I just want to mark that, because we're not going to go deeply into historical context or historical political context, but we also don't want folks to assume that that isn't something that we are very clear about the broader context and the framework for it, right? We are a product of this story and this history, even if our people, or many of our people, hail from other countries. So with that being said, just want to ground us in, we're going to talk about intergenerational trauma, a couple of definitions of what trauma is. So two definitions I personally like a lot, which I like to use within the network and in education materials, is when a real or perceived threat overwhelms the body's natural ability to protect or defend itself. So we know that trauma and traumatic experiences and traumatic sort of energy, survival energy, can live in our bodies for a long time. Not only that, but it can be transferred to our offspring or our communities. And so for us, it's like, it's not only the perceived threat, but the real threat. So we many times still walk around feeling unsafe, even if we've never been violated in the ways that our ancestors have, right? And the natural ability to protect ourselves both is like our literal bodily function, our bodily ability, inherent ability to protect ourselves, but also our community-wide ability to really fight for our rights, or sometimes we can community-wise get sick, right? Peter Levine says traumatic symptoms are not caused by the event itself. They arise when the residual energy from the experience is not discharged from the body. the energy remains trapped in the nervous system where it can wreak havoc on our bodies and our mind. So I just want to emphasize, this will be my last point, that this residual energy is a lot of what many of our traditional healers talk about, from those who have had any experiences with curanderismo, people who even do acupuncture, folks that do like traditional chiropractic work, which are like hueseros, what we call them in definitely my country, and other folks that do breath work and other spirit work. I think, you know, it's important to name that this residual energy that gets trapped in our nervous system can wreak havoc in the ways that we're stuck in survival mode, we're stuck in fight, freeze or flee mode, and our emotional reactions can often work against us because we are reacting to that energy of trauma versus the actual situation happening around us, right? And so our survival mechanisms can actually work against us if if our nervous system isn't in sync with what's happening in our exterior or an environment, right? Why? Because we're still responding to that energy that is stuck in us, right? And you can spend lifetimes doing that. That's why we cope in different ways. And communities, whole communities can spend lifetimes in that coping place, in that survival energy place. And we know that for hundreds of years, many of our communities have. And what we need is healing in all kinds of ways, right? So I just wanted to name that and ground us in that. Is there examples that you see? You can put it on the chat of how oppression is organized to sort of wield trauma, to control and distribute it. You're welcome to put it on the chat and share with us if you see this or if this feels obvious to you in different ways, and how this system sort of organizes trauma or wields it against entire communities or individuals. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over actually to Griselda, to Blanca, Valentin, to take it from here. Let me fix this real quick, this presentation mode. Bear with us, everybody. Ooh. What is this?
Well, while you're doing that, maybe I could introduce myself.
Go for it.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. Just filled with gratitude for your participation. So thank you for that. I am a practicing, well, I've taken a pause, but a licensed mental health clinician, and I've been doing work in the community in the Boston area, particularly with communities of color, for about 20 years. One of the things that I've shared that in my work over 20 years ago, when I first graduated college and was working in in the community, was one of my first jobs was as a DCF or CPS, depending on where you are. It's the Children's Services Department. And just remembering, this was prior to, and I won't say how old I am, but this is prior to electronic health records. So we had closets full of binders of the families that were being serviced by the agency. And one of the things that struck me very early on were the binderfuls of generations, meaning that there had been families that had been through the system over and over, 3 or 4 generations of children that had been growing up in the DCF system. And back then, I did not have the word. I did not understand what it was. I was providing a service and I was providing support, yet I did not have the language. And so for me, as the presenter, one of my goals for today is for us to begin to have some, whether it's an understanding or you may know, and this is something that you're looking for in terms of developing tools, but that we are planting a seed of understanding of what intergenerational trauma is, and a seed of understanding of how it impacts us, and it impacts the communities, whether it's us individually, us as a family system, or those that we provide services to, but more, and also as the community. And in order to understand intergenerational trauma, and I really liked this quote that Griselda actually found, and it really puts it into perspective, which is any traumatic situation that results in a pattern of traumatic or unhealthy behaviors or beliefs throughout the generations. And with that said, I want you to think about, for a moment, in your own family, within your own family system, are you aware of, or do you know of any event or situation that has impacted your family in a negative way? It could be, a family secret. It could be, some of us may think about a family curse. And in the way that we have not resolved those thoughts and those beliefs and those things that have happened to us. And the impact that that has, not only in the way in which we show up in the world, but also the impact that it has on our generations. There is a native Iroquois philosophy that I really, really like. And it talks about it's around the 7 generations, and the importance of, and what it says, it's about what you deliver, what you give into the world, what you give into the impact of your decisions, meaning, and that could be anything, right? That could be from the way in which we treat water and in which we treat Mother Earth, to the way that the food that we put in our bodies, to the way that we address or don't address these trauma situations and the patterns that impact us in toxic ways. And I'm pretty sure if you pause for a moment and you think about your own family, that you could think of examples, that, and you could feel free to add those in the box, examples of how these, whether it's the secrets or this idea of a curse, have impacted the way in which not only you view and see the world, but also how you show up in the world for yourself and for others. I think that one of the things that it's really important to recognize, and for me personally, has been is this, this idea of legacy, right? We often think about, and as I'm Boricua. You see the flag behind me, the machetes. And so for me, the importance of, the legacy of my culture, the legacy of what it means to be Boricua is really important. One legacy that we often don't talk about is the legacy of trauma. And we are, passing that legacy down as well. And what does that mean for us as the community? And what does it mean for us as a collective? And I'm wondering, and I want to pose a question for you all really quickly, is how have you seen trauma or an hechizo or a curse or a family secret manifest in your own families? And I know I wanted to kind of check in the chat, but also be able to share. But I think we all have, right? We all have these stories. We all have these tales, and the importance of being able to recognize that and being able to recognize the impact that this has, not only on us, but in the generations, and the favor that we do to those past generations when you begin to think about and talk about how this has impacted you personally.
So in the chat, Blanca, somebody said domestic violence. Someone also said it can definitely create a lot of tension and microaggressions. And then someone said family secrets coming out during Me Too was really difficult. Alcohol is self-medication. Just saying like all men cheat, that's just the way they are, and so literally all the men in the family doing that. Teen pregnancy, sexual abuse. Yeah, these are some of the things folks are naming. Alcoholism. Thank you so much for sharing, everybody. Distrust, alcoholism. My older brother has a lot of emotions from childhood he hasn't been able to talk about, sorry. So I just wanted to share from the chat.
And I think that one of the things, and thank you all, I think one of the things that we often do, and it's a defense mechanism, we just move forward and just attempt to deal. And almost a form of habit, these patterns that we pick up because it is the way that we have done it all the way. It's the way that our families have done it all the way. And I think that one of the things that, it's really important to recognize that the same way that recipes are passed down, even though I can't quite get my grandmother's arroz con gandules the right way, we also passing down these, toxic, ways in which we attempt to cope with it. And sometimes we, just again say, it's just the way it's been. It's just the way that our culture is. It's the way that we've grown up, and we don't have another way of addressing it and managing it. And being able to acknowledge that, right? And I am a strong believer, and I have actually my grandparents' pictures in front of me, that they would have done better if they'd known better, right? And I think that is truly not only a manifestation, but also a way of acknowledging that the reason why we're here was because there was resiliency also in our ancestors, and this intergenerational trauma that has been passed down not only to our behaviors, but also to our systems, like the way that, Fran mentioned it earlier, the way that trauma impacts us, our bodies, and our ability to take care of ourselves. It's really important. One of the ways as well, and we talk about this less, and in our field, in the mental health field, and the social work field, or the clinical world, there's less discussion around the impact of the way in which collective or historical trauma impacts. And I see, Griselda, that you wanted to mention something.
Oh, yeah, I just didn't know if you were moving on to the next slide. If I was.
No, that was you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Blanca. I loved everything that you said, and it made me think about the phrase that everybody does the best with what they have at any given time. So anyways, my name is Griselda, and sorry to interrupt with my introduction, but I also live in the Boston area. I'm a licensed social worker, still very new to the field, although I've worked in social work in different capacities for about 5 or 6 years. What was I gonna say? Like Francisca and Blanca shared, I have, my own personal reasons and professional reasons for wanting to be involved with this presentation. And I think, similar to other things, this is an evolving thing for myself and for the work that I do with clients. Blanca gave a definition of intergenerational trauma. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about how it gets passed on from generation to generation. So like we said, it's when there's unresolved, effects of the trauma that get passed on. So when there's no healing work that happens. And so that can be physiologically, which basically just means through the body. And one word that you may or may not be familiar with is epigenetics. So epigenetics is basically the ways in which trauma impacts our bodies at the level of like our DNA, our genes. And there's a lot of studies that we won't get into today that came out as a result of the Holocaust. And so there were the direct survivors of the Holocaust, and then the impact on their children, and then their children's children. And because it impacted such a large number of people, they were able to get a lot of data from. And so it wasn't just the experience of the violence, the systematic violence, but it was also, you know, the impact of starvation, of things that were happening at the cellular level that was then getting passed on. So, for example, diabetes occurring in the grandchildren's generation because of famine that happened in the grandparents' generation. Another way that trauma is passed on is environmental. So this is kind of like the way a household can feel, like the climate of a household. You know, is there like a depressing climate within the household? And so there can be direct trauma from the family environment. And I also want to say too that when we say family, it doesn't have to just be your biological family. It can be your chosen family, adoptive family, whatever family means to you. And also, you know, environmentally speaking, what feelings are allowed in your family system, or what feelings are rejected in that sort of environment. And then socially passed on trauma can be learned behaviors. So let's say you have a parent with alcoholism, and they tend to shut themselves in their room when they come home from work. And so as an adult, you start to shut yourself in your room when you come home from work and you don't know why. That's just like a learned behavior. That's not necessarily a direct trauma from your environment, but it's something that you picked up from your parent or from your parent's parent, wherever that initial behavior started from, that you're then exhibiting and sort of, yeah, just not knowing why, or maybe you do know why. And then I also added systemically, so a reminder that there are larger forces at play, you know, like we grounded in the beginning with oppression. So forces acting on the family, like poverty, racism, that hinder any like family members' efforts to sort of improve or heal. So we inherit those systems with which we're involved as well. Next slide. So again, I just wanted to also, many of you may have heard of the term historical trauma as well. So that's basically when there's a large scale traumatic event or a set of policies that impacts a certain part of the population or a certain country. And it's not necessarily intergenerational trauma, but it can definitely intersect in the sense that, you know, families that are impacted by that historical event then have things passed on throughout the generations. And I won't go into details, and you all will have access to these links when we send out the presentation. But there is what's called post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is, you know, it has impacted the descendants of slaves within African-American communities, which, you know, causes patterns like vacant esteem, marked propensity for anger and violence, racist socialization and internalized racism. And then there's, you know, the Holocaust survivors, like I mentioned before, forced migration, military rule, civil war among Latinx populations, and the impact of settler colonialism on indigenous populations. And I've included here a colonialism toolkit that talks more about that. But on the next slide, so now that we've sort of, you know, defined it, and talk about how it gets transmitted from generation to generation, I wanted to talk a little bit about the signs and defenses that occur within an individual or within a family that happen as a result of this intergenerational trauma. So, the first one is denial. So you might only want to focus on the here and now. And although that's very important in a lot of ways, it is also important to understand your family's history, to understand your community's history, and how that impacts the here and now. And that requires, some introspection and acceptance. Minimization is kind of similar to denial, although it's not as strong, and it makes the problem seem smaller so that it gives the impression that it's more manageable. I don't know if any of you can, as I'm talking about these, think of family members who exhibited any of these defenses, or if you have exhibited any of these defenses at any given time. There's also the transference of emotional and psychological instability. So that's where a lot of you talked about substance abuse issues in your families. So this is one way, this is a type of defense to intergenerational trauma. So coping with substances, having biases about therapy, thinking that therapy won't work, self-medicating, and things like that. And then there's stormy parent-child relationships. So how toxicity within relationships can get passed on from generation to generation. It could be around like styles around disciplining, things like that, like using the chancla, and then there's also low self-esteem and low self-efficacy. So the idea that you're not enough, not organized, or that you have the ability to be skilled, that's something that we also inherit. And then there's, unresolved psychiatric needs. So, there might have been family members with major mental illness or things like that that weren't called by their diagnosis. And so, they were maybe considered like the strange family member, and they weren't given proper treatment. And so then there was a lot of stigmatizing around that family member. And then you might start to develop symptoms of a mental health disorder, and that internalized stigma that you learn from your family, causes you to feel a certain type of way about your own needs. And then there's complacency. So the idea that there's no need to try to heal because it's not going to change anything because everyone in the family is doomed. Kind of goes back to what Blanca was talking about with the curse. When you feel like you have a curse, you kind of feel like it's impossible to overcome. And then there's borderline behaviors. So that can happen when there's not a lot of empathy or recognition of your own goals or mind when you're in your environment. So like an invalidating type of environment. And so you begin to exhibit behaviors that are kind of like a light switch. You can feel kind of like on and off, like you can be happy 1 minute and really frustrated the next. Okay, next slide. So this is just a continuation of that. I like visuals. And I put the accounts where I found these memes on the memes themselves. But yeah, so it says, trauma responses can look like, and again, this is like something that may have occurred in you or something that occurred in a family member of, craving emotional control, feeling on guard all the time, chronic feelings of emptiness. And then the other meme on the right says, families carrying trauma, it says will, but I would change that to say may, connect through chaos and crisis. They may unconsciously attempt to control and enable each other. This next one is kind of common in my family, criticizing each other's appearance, habits, or interests, boundary crossing. And again, these lists are not at all extensive, but I just wanted to provide some examples to also just normalize it and to put a connection here, because sometimes we wonder where these things come from. And so I would just, a reflecting question I would ask about these, you know, do any of these feel true to you? And, you know, which ones would you add? Which ones would you remove? And yeah, I mean, that's something you can reflect on in the chat or reflect on in your own time.
Something that some folks have said during your piece, somebody who works, says, the group I work with, Jewish activists for immigration justice of Western Massachusetts, who witnessed at the Homestead Child Detention Center in Florida, is very concerned about the trauma upon trauma that kids or adults have escaped from, trauma and violence along the migration route, trauma from ICE detention or threat of ICE raids, trauma of deportations of parents and family members. So it's just that compounded trauma, right? Also, there's some research that Ed Norton just pointed out around recent studies around high suicide rates in Northern Ireland, traced to the violence witnessed by earlier generations, and that he can share that research with us at some point. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. Yeah, the compounded trauma is very real, and also, you know, something I want to mention too is that when we talk about intergenerational trauma and what we inherit from the past, but again, you know, when you have these repeating cycles, it's also happening in your present. And so if you're still dealing with it in your present, it can be very hard to impact, you know, what's happened in the past. But something I heard recently that was very helpful was that the only way to change a pattern is to change behavior. It's you know, a matter, you know, seeking that help if it's available, you know, because these are all patterns. And so if it's a very uncomfortable process, but changing up what you're doing from how previous generations have done it, it can feel like you're sort of like denying your family traditions in some ways. But, you know, it's also important to be in tune with how you, who exist today, need to survive. Yeah, so Blanca, if you want to talk about the impact.
Yeah, I just wanted to add before I move into the impact, because I'm sitting here recognizing that this week, particularly for those of us who are Boricuas, we're reminded that Hurricane Maria happened 3 years ago this Sunday. And so the impact of when traumatic situations happen to our communities, right? And, you know, what is the impact of, you know, these things when it's collective? You know, the other thing that I recently found in my research, because I'm really interested in finding out how, you know, again, how to best support those that I provide services to in this context of not only intergenerational trauma, but also historical trauma. And one of the things that I found recently was that, you know, maybe you are all familiar with boarding schools and how natives who are placed in indigenous schools to acculturate and to strip them of their culture, identity, and language. I recently learned that they were, back in 1898, that there were Puerto Rican children brought into boarding schools. And so putting into perspective for me, that not only that moment in time in 1898, but also what the impact of that had. I'm somewhat familiar with the impact that it's had on indigenous communities here to have had their children removed from and put in boarding schools, but also natural disasters such as Hurricane Maria 3 years ago. And more recently was the hearing that of a forced sterilization of women in ICE. And as not only as a provider, right, as somebody who provides services, but also as a human being, what happened to me when I read that news was that it impacted me physically. I began to have physical pains as a result of hearing those news. And so I wanted to really, identify that the trauma, the way that it impacts intergenerational trauma, that only impacts us individually within our families, but also as a collective. And knowing, to your point, Griselda, that it continues to pass on, and the importance of being able to identify how it impacts us. We know that in communities of color, diabetes, high blood pressure are extremely prevalent. And we are able to link those directly to trauma and the way in which our bodies respond to response to trauma. The impact within our families, the way that we relate or don't relate to each other, the chancla culture, the way in which we respond when we don't like something that is being said to us. So the way that we even manage anger. It's been really important. One of the most, and this is for me, one of the, always a priority in terms of the way in which we don't treat, acknowledge, or recognize in the way in which mental health impacts our communities. Such a taboo to receive support for our mental health. And one of the things that I remember, when I was working with children, speaking to parents about, if your child had a medical condition, I know that you're a good parent, you seek their care immediately, and not seeing mental health such as, as big of a priority or a big as of importance around searching and needing to get those supports. And that links in with the distrust, right? We have reasons not to trust big systems, and not only the therapeutic system, but hospitals, the judicial system. We have reasons not to trust, and so just being aware of how this has impacted, again, you personally, your family, the way in which you relate to others, but also in the bigger community. One of the things is, the poor sense of self. I think that it's, I see this a lot, whether you internalize the way that you were treated, and you internalize the way in which you are receiving this insidious, treatment that we are often not even aware that is happening and that is impacting us. And so ensuring that that you recognize, that you acknowledge, and that you are exactly who you need to recognize and to heal. Now here, healing legacies of pain. This is a lot of information. Maybe or maybe not, it might have triggered some memories in you that you may not have had. So I want us to pause here and acknowledge if there's any tension you are holding, if there's any feelings that you are holding that may be tensing you up, that you breathe into that and you give yourself some TLC. Take a few deep breaths. It is a lot of information from the chat. I know that they are each individual and collectively holding a lot of history, of stories. But another one of my goals is that we leave here acknowledging and recognizing that there is also the possibility of healing. So 30 seconds, breathe into your space where you are feeling the most tension. And acknowledge that it's not all lost. So the next slide. And I really, it's more about the healing, generational self-trauma. And when we heal ourselves, we heal the next generation that follows. Pain is passed through the family line until someone is ready to feel it, heal it, and let it go. And this is you. You are it. And so for me, in my journey, not only as a human being and as a person who has experienced trauma, is recognizing and acknowledging that trauma is a human experience. Sadly, I don't know that anybody is free of this experience. Yet we have so much power and we have so much, in our healing. Telling your story, it doesn't have to be lost. It doesn't all have to be sadness. It's just like reclaiming it, right? The way we tell our stories, it's extremely important and extremely powerful in our healing. So sharing your gifts, we've learned something. We're not here by chance. There is resiliency and there was power in that. And so now it's for us to build and form that legacy of possibility, of healing. Reconnecting to your roots, we belong. This is exactly where you need to be at this exact moment in time. So grounding yourself in that you are where you need to be right now. And this is one of my favorites, right? Like the seeking, we've lost, I mentioned, my grandmother's arroz con gandula recipe. Like there's this wisdom and this knowledge that even though she's no longer here, that I carry with me. And one of the things that I've chosen to do is to really focus on those things that will nurture me around her wisdom and her knowledge. And if you don't have an abuelita and abuelito, there are neighbors in our community. There are elders in our community that are often on their own and have so much wisdom to share. And within that, right, is that, when we are removed from our land, we also lose sight of that connection to land and the importance of being able to go back to and reclaiming again those parts of us that were rituals, our medicines. I remember my grandmother had a small yard, but it was filled with herbs, and I would walk in with a headache and she knew exactly what to make me. And finding those things that ground you, that are connected to earth, but also to that knowledge that we all have, and it's in our blood, and it will not leave us and it will not abandon us. And rebuilding your spirit. I think one of the things that we often forget is that the impact that trauma or stress has on the 4 parts of us: the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And the importance of, if we don't have balance within those 4, we're going to have a really hard time showing up and taking care of ourselves. And so the building of your spirit means that, right? What is the medicine that provides you what you need at this moment in time? And another one that for me, it's not here, but it's like the idea of decolonizing. That's why I have my machetes, because I'm ready for this fight, is decolonizing the way in which we see healing in BIPOC communities. One thing is to sit across from a therapist, be given a prescription, but we need to go back. I strongly, believe as a clinician, as a therapist, that recognizing and acknowledging the medicine that was taken from us at one point, that we need to reclaim that and bring that back into who we are and what we do. The other thing that I wanted to add, there's a number of, there could be a number of providers here. And the last point that I wanted to add around this is that it is really important that as direct workers or as clinical providers, that you learn about not only the historical trauma of those that you are providing services to, but also that you ask questions. I remember being in an organization a few years ago where we served a lot of immigrants. And as the intake packet did not ask a question as to how did you get here? How did you arrive here? Tell me your migration story. And often there is a trauma around the way in which we either come to the mainland, whether it's leaving family behind or whatever that is. And how can you work again with a primarily immigrant community and not ask that question. So creating a sense of awareness as to who you are providing services to, and ensuring that you are asking those questions so that you're acknowledging and recognizing what that means. And the other thing is that as a community, particularly as a community of color, we have practiced survival mode. We are here, 104 of us strong at one point, but now it's time to truly live your life in a way that provides you some of this grounding that I mentioned. I really hope that this is helpful, and I really hope that it gives you some tools as to how to provide some of for yourself and to others.
Thank you, Blanca. Similar to what Blanca was just talking about, again, I wanted to add some visuals. And, so there's a couple memes here. One that says, when we dance, we heal our ancestors. And I, just want to talk about the ways in which dancing and movement are no joke. And although they're very fun, and that the same way that violence and traumatic factors shaped our cells and DNA of our ancestors, is the way that movement and dance and other healing practices change our DNA as well. And how breath even changes our DNA. And that resiliency is inherited as well. So, we've talked a lot about the ways in which we inherit trauma. And we've also, at the same time, inherited resiliency as well. And that could be survival, ways of survival, ways of, which is through recipes, being able to cook on a budget, things like that. And so, when you're starting your healing journey, it's not necessarily about disavowing, the trauma that you've inherited or the resiliency that you've inherited, but, also getting to know yourself and getting to know what's in your environment. What are the things that have influenced you? And what are the things that you are going to be carrying forward? What is your legacy going to be? And so sort of taking inventory of, yes, the trauma, and inventory of, yes, the resiliency, and taking stock of, okay, what is still useful to me now? Because your answer to that question is going to be what helps future generations. Next slide, please. So you might be wondering, when is a good time to seek help with your healing journey, and how might you do that? So again, these lists are not exhaustive, but I just wanted to provide something. So you might want to seek help with your healing journey if you're feeling alone and or helpless. Maybe you're experiencing the same patterns, the same communication patterns within your family, and you just don't know how to change it, and you just need someone outside of your family, or sometimes within your family, to just provide a different perspective and help you sort of change that pattern. Maybe you're feeling like enough is enough, like you're so overwhelmed that you just need to try something different. Maybe you're intruding thoughts and feeling, or you're having intruding thoughts and feelings when you're trying to carry out other functions in your life. It's getting in the way of work. It's getting in the way of doing your day-to-day things. And then the other thing is just whenever you want. You don't have to wait for there to be a crisis. You don't have to wait for there to be all these stressors in order to start therapy, or any other sort of help for your healing journey. And then for the how, I just put some tips for if you do decide that therapy is the way you want to go. These are, I think, useful ways to find a therapist. One, making sure that they accept new patients, making sure that they specialize in what your family needs. So when you go on Psychology Today or any other sort of therapist directory, maybe even the Latinx Therapist Action Network directory, you can look at their specialties. So it'll say if they specialize in grief, family work, trauma. And so just look for words that make sense to your story. And then see if, if the therapist is trauma informed. Even if it doesn't necessarily say intergenerational trauma, if they're trauma informed, that could be helpful to you as well. And then if you select a therapist that doesn't have, that's not working out for you, feel free to find another one. They don't always work the first time around. It took me 3 tries to find a therapist that worked well for me. Okay, next slide. So the other thing I want to say is that not everyone likes or heals from psychotherapy, or maybe what works for you with your individual therapy is not going to be the thing that helps you with your intergenerational trauma. And so, just being open and curious and accepting about what your healing journey looks like. And so other healing areas could include things that tend to your physical body. So we've talked about how intergenerational trauma manifests physically in our genes. So you might have some chronic physical ailments that haven't been addressed. So starting with your physician or a holistic healer to get those physical ailments addressed might actually impact the mental, emotional. Somatic healing, which Francisca knows more about that, yoga, mindfulness, meditation, and when you're looking for yoga, you might want to search something that's POC centered, or even there are ones that are specific for intergenerational trauma yoga, or healing yoga. And then group work, healing circles, like Blanca mentioned, talking to elders in the community. You can also just do your own cultural exploration through reading, journaling, art projects. And then there's this thing called genograms and ecomaps, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So this is a tool that is used a lot in therapy. And I know it might be kind of weird that I'm bringing it up here for you all to do on your own, but I think it's actually an interesting activity if you feel like emotionally safe doing it. It's kind of like an expanded family tree. And this could actually be a type of art project that you do. So the one in the picture is actually mine that I had to do for a school assignment for my family therapy class. And there was a lot that I discovered through doing this. And I put this website here. It's for the Transgenerational Trauma and Resilience Genogram, which was developed by this person, Rachel D. Goodman. So I liked that that's not the model that I used for mine, but I like that this one focuses on transgenerational trauma. But basically, it's a way for you to take whatever information you already have. Don't feel stressed about what you don't know about your family. Just take what you do know about your family, and you can start by mapping out who you know in your family, what you know about them, and then create a key of things you want to track. Like you could track diseases, you could track how many times people have moved, how many kids people have had, things like that. And then just step back and look at your genogram and see, and kind of like look at it phenomenologically, like just observe it. Don't have any judgments come in, and just say, oh, I see that this person has like the same dental issues that I have. Or I see that, wow, this side of the family like has a lot of gastrointestinal issues, and this other side of the family doesn't. And you just start to see patterns as you go. And what I noticed when doing this activity is that the more I saw the things exist within my family, the less I felt like it was an individual problem. And that's not to say that it's not my responsibility to heal, but it also helped me feel like not as alone, and kind of made sense why people are the way they are within my family. So it's kind of like a cool exercise to practice radical acceptance and non-judgmental ways of looking at our families, which is a path to healing. And then I didn't put an example of an eco map here, but an eco map is more about mapping out who your current supports are. So not necessarily your family, but it could be your church, it could be your school, it could be different things in the community or certain individuals who surround you. And they might not be active all the time in your life. And you put yourself at the center in a circle or whatever shape you want, and put everyone else around you. And then you just draw lines connecting you to those other people or institutions, and come up with a system for the type of line that tells you the type of relationship you have with those systems. And again, zooming out, looking at your eco map and saying, okay, what's the quality of my relationships right now? And sort of with this curious stance, not like, oh my God, I don't know anybody, or I don't have anybody in my life, but more just like, here's where things are today. What can I do? Or what do I need to do? Do I need to do anything right now? Who can help me with my intergenerational trauma if that's something that I want to address? So those are just a couple of tools. Next slide. And I thought it would be important to just talk about the challenges that happen along the way. And, you know, because there are challenges in the healing journey, like we said, it's not impossible, but it can be pretty disruptive with any trauma work and any work on oneself, period. And so some of the things that can come up are complacency. So we talked about that at the beginning, when you feel like, what's the point of doing anything because no one's going to change. But the truth is that you will change. Even if no one else in your family does, you will change as a result of this. And then, you know, there could be gaslighting from family members. You know, you might discover something about a family member and then try to confirm it with them or someone else. And they'll say, oh, that never happened. And then, you know, you start to feel like, well, am I wrong? Like, I don't know, you know, is this true or not? And so that can be, you know, a lonely process, and that can maybe create some changed relationships with your family members, alive or deceased. Maybe you find out something about an abuelito that you didn't want to know about and changes the way you're grieving them. You know, and it can bring up grief, which is like grief around letting go of ways that you knew somebody, and maybe changing your perspective about how you know somebody. And all of these things are normal and more. I didn't include everything that can happen, but all these things are normal. And so I put a little meme here to sort of it grounded me when I had some of these feelings. So it says, if you catch your mind starting to move in old familiar patterns that you worked or are working really hard to break, like fixation, self-doubt, anxiety around attachments, etc., it can really help to push harder into yourself and things you value. So this person put mutual aid, activism, art, self-care, nurturing your friendships, or whatever those things are to you. Next. And then these are just some resources. Couple people who are on our directory who offer yoga and specialize in intergenerational trauma. Put the links to their profiles. And then I put a couple therapy modalities that are good for intergenerational trauma that you can search for when you're searching for a therapist. And then Cultural Fabric is an organization that I'm tied to here in Boston, but Melissa Alexis, who does the classes, their yoga classes, and leadership classes around anti-racism. She provides them online during COVID. So even if you're not based in Boston, you can participate. And I know Blanca will add more before we send it out to you all. And then I think Francisca has a closing exercise for us.
I just wanted to say really quickly before Francisca closes that as I hear you speak, you know, one of the things that came to my mind is for us to not only be gentle with ourselves, but to remember that it did not start with you, but it can end with you. And so, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Blanca and Griselda. I want to just share a 2-minute poem. I'm not the one reciting it, but I wanted you to hear it. It's from my good friend, Noni Lamar. She is this Black poet who is very gifted and also is, you know, a sage in all kinds of ways. So here we go. And just know that you're going to get the recording to this webinar. You're going to get materials. I know somebody said the genogram thing wasn't working for them because they have to be part of this research engine. So we'll make sure we get all that together for you. So look out for it. And so here's the poem.
Forgive your bloodline. They were depressed. They were anxious. They were poor. They were lonely and listless. They had no raising. Mothers cleaning white houses, fathers finding solace in a needle in the bottom of the bottle. Forgive your kin. They didn't know better. No one was raising them. They sat alone with a fistful of colors. They needed a holding. They longed for a lullaby. They were immigrants. They grew up too soon. They stumbled through English. They ate their culture in cramped corners. They had a lifetime of playing pretend. Forgive them. Forgive them. Let it go. Give them mercy. Practice grace. They were trying. They had high hopes. They had dreams about you being better than them. When their lovers sang into their womb, they prayed for you, for your freedom, for your brown face to be constantly cracked with laughter, for cupboards to never be empty, your belly full. Forgive your bloodline, even the monsters. Yes, forgive them too. The narcissists, the rapists, the racist, that uncle on your mother's side who took away your mama's trust for you. Forgive him. Send him on his way. Let him learn them lessons again. Let him do better. Forgive that part of you. Lay the alms. Light the candles. Cover yourself in milk baths and lilies and let the novenas call spirits into your room. And forgive them. Forgive them. Forgive them. Forgive them. Let it go. Forgive them. Forgive them. Let it go. Forgive them. Forgive them. Let it go. Forgive them. Let it go. 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 Forgive them.
Thank you, everybody. We love you. Thank you for being in the space with us, and you'll be getting all the materials. Any questions you all know, you can hit us up at Latinx Therapist Action Network at gmail.org. Take good care.
Thank you all.